With all of the focus on Ukraine, there needs to be attention on the Pacific as well, because the United States is not just trying to encircle and contain Russia. They're also doing the same process to China. And just as they're using Ukraine against Russia, they are using Taiwan against China. They're also using Australia. So joining me today is Robbie Barwick. He's the research director at Australian Citizens Party. And we're going to talk about the Solomon Islands and this recent security deal struck with China. And we're going to talk about the Western reaction and more specifically Australia's role in all of this. So welcome, Robbie. Thank you for joining me. Can you just quickly introduce yourself? What is the Australian Citizens Party? And then we could get right into the topic.
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be here. The Australian Citizens Party is one of the minor parties in Australia, but we're a pretty successful one. We don't have any members of parliament, but we've been fighting for more than 30 years for a different approach to the economy. You could, if you want to boil it down, you could say we're opposed to neoliberalism and neoconservatism, and they're actually very closely related, because the neoconservative foreign policy model, which is just apologism for the Anglo-American empire, actually serves the Wall Street, City of London financial interests who think that governments should just, give up their power to financial and corporate elites, right, so that they can, loot countries at will. It's a revival of the old East India Company empire model, and we're opposed to what that does to us domestically in our economy. We're also opposed to what it does to the world in terms of foreign policy. And for a country like Australia, we don't have an independent foreign policy. And that's, as a party, we're very committed to fighting for us to have an independent foreign policy.
Yes, and I just want to point people's attention to this incredible interview you did with veteran Australian diplomat John Lander. And the link to this will be in the video description below. I suggest everyone watch this. There's so much important information in this discussion about Australia, how its foreign policy has been subordinated to Washington and U.S. interests for years and years. It wasn't always that way. And it has very recently become worse, much worse.
It wasn't always this bad. We had we referred to it in the interview. In 2015, one of our former prime ministers passed away, but the year before he did, his name was Malcolm Fraser. He wrote a book called Dangerous Allies, and that was his description for the United States and the United Kingdom. And his argument was Australia's never been independent. We're always dependent on either the United Kingdom or subservient to the United Kingdom. Now the United States, frankly, they're both in it together. But John Lander represents a generation that did aspire to asserting an independence in our foreign policy. He cut his teeth as a young diplomat in the Whitlam government in the 1970s, and unfortunately, that was one of the governments that was a victim of United States and British regime change behind the scenes. Very similar, or not very similar. Like, it was more sophisticated than what was done to Allende in Chile, etc. But the U.S. ambassador, I'll give you an example. The U.S. ambassador in Australia in 1975, when it happened, was the same U.S. ambassador who was in Indonesia in 1965 when the U.S. overthrew the Sukarno regime and replaced it with the Suharto regime. And we were victims of that. So that's the era John Lander started as a diplomat. He and his generation tried very hard to assert more independence in our foreign policy. They actually had some good success. And John describes how he retired in 1996, pretty happy with how things were going. He got to go back to China. He'd been a diplomat in China in the 70s. He got to go back to China. He enjoyed visiting China every year for the next 20 odd years, until suddenly he noticed that this has drastically changed really fast, and this hostility is alarming. And he's speaking up in retirement to say, look, this is going to end in tears, people, and people really need to heed his warning.
So Australia, the U.S. Depicts Australia as a loyal ally, is doing it out of their own free will and eagerness. but actually there's a lot of coercion behind the scenes. And just as we're seeing in the crisis with Ukraine, how Europe has been coerced behind the scenes and pressured, and companies in Germany were even sanctioned over Nord Stream 2. This is what the US does to everybody. That they do it more blatantly and maybe openly and enthusiastically towards non-Western countries, but they also do it to Western countries, including Australia. So getting onto the topic of the Solomon Islands, in 2019, they switched recognition from Taipei to Beijing. And if people don't understand that, there's the Republic of China based in Taipei and the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And most nations in the world, including Australia and the United States and the UK, all of the AUKUS members, they recognize Beijing. This is for their own self-interest so that they can do business with mainland China. But then they coerce and bribe countries like the Solomon Islands to recognize Taipei. And they suffer all of the pitfalls of doing that. But in 2019, the Solomon Islands decided, no, they're going to switch to Beijing, and they're going to start pivoting toward China, like many countries are all around the world. And ever since then, there's been a lot of tension. I covered in a previous video, USA dumping millions of dollars into Malaita, this other island, populated island, separate from the main island, Guadalcanal, where the capital is. And they bypassed the central government to just, basically they're bribing them to induce separatism and trying to continue recognizing Taiwan over Beijing. So what is Australia's role?
Blatant foreign interference. So I was just going to comment on what you said. Blatant foreign interference by the United States.
Absolutely. And so what is Australia's role in all of this? Because now the Solomon Islands wants a security pact with China. They have one with Australia. So maybe you can explain some of the background, the history between Australia and the Solomon Islands, and how it has led up to this, and why Australia and the United States seem to have such a big problem with China now having a security pact with the Solomon Islands.
Well, depends on how much history you want to cover. There is a terrible history that goes way back a century or more, where Australia had its own slavery, and that came from Pacific islands like the Solomon Islands. They were called the Kanakas, and we would go and grab them over in those islands and bring them to the sugarcane fields of Queensland, where I'm from, to work in those sugarcane fields. And it was actual slavery that we had, and it's something that everyone knows about. Don't like talking about it much. We certainly doesn't get the attention of the United States slavery, but of course, our relationship to these Pacific islands, like the Solomons, like Papua New Guinea, it reflects the outlook of our government. So I'm sure there have been times when the relationship has been mutually respectful, and we want to be helpful, etc. But what we've had, the period I'm most familiar with is the last 2 decades, which that probably applies to most people. But in 2003, George Bush referred to Australia as America's deputy sheriff, and it's a moniker that our Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, who was the one who committed us to the Iraq War, was pretty happy with, until it dawned on the Australian government how the rest of the Asia Pacific thought of that term, right? Who the hell do you think you are? Was the diplomatic response we got from Indonesia, from Malaysia, right? United States. Why does the United States have a claim to the Asia Pacific, let alone get to say who's going to be the deputy sheriff? But I've got a clip from 2018 where a man who may be a future foreign minister, who is in the Labor Party opposition here, this is so deep in the psyche of Australia that he actually said in this television interview that his name's Richard Marles. He was the foreign spokesman at the time. And I'll give you the context in which he said it. But what he said first is, we're expected to lead in the Pacific by the United States, right? And so when you understand that's what's in their head, the policies that we that we apply to the Pacific and the way we treat our Pacific Island neighbours is driven by that. The other day there was a government minister who commented that our contribution to a country, it was actually talking about the Solomon Islands. We contribute to the Solomon Islands because we provide them work. And what he meant was there's a scheme where they are itinerant fruit and vegetable pickers in Australian farms. They're cheap labour for our farms, and that's somehow our contribution to their economic development. Whereas, of course, what China has brought to them, Brian, is real economic development, like it's brought to the rest of the world. Now, the Solomons, if you look at it on a map, is just to the east of Papua New Guinea. And of course, Papua New Guinea is one half of the big Papua Island, and the other half is West Papua, which is part of Indonesia. That area is incredibly rich in resources, incredibly rich. The richest copper mine in the world is in between Papua New Guinea and the Solomons. It's called Bougainville. And this is, everybody, eyes it off for that reason. A couple of years ago, just to give you a sense of the different approach, I'll refer to something that happened in Papua New Guinea now. The Australian government thinks because Papua New Guinea, we've only ever had one colony, and that was Papua New Guinea, and it became independent of us in 1975. But the Australian government, of course, like every other former colonial power, thinks we still own these places. We were doing our normal aid program, but our aid program involved things like donating money to Papua New Guinea to encourage tribal women to run for politics, right? Which is, fine, whatever. China's contribution to Papua New Guinea was building a highway across the Owen Stanley Ranges, which, if you know the story of World War II, that's where the fighting was between the Australians and the Japanese that stopped the Japanese advance in the war. It was where they were turned back in those ranges. My grandfather fought in that. It's some of the most inhospitable fighting conditions in the world. There's these jungle mountains. The Chinese built a highway across it, and think how the Papua New Guineans weighed up the two types of development, right? And so the Solomons have experienced the same thing, and it's just become we can't. I would say we can't match China. We certainly don't match China because we don't have the intention to actually have concrete development in these places like the Chinese do, because the Chinese see it as win-win. And I actually understand the Chinese mindset there. If they make their trading partners richer, that's good for them too. Like long term, that's good for them too. We don't think that way. And so when a country like Solomon says, well, this is a great country to have a relationship with, our knee-jerk reaction is, in calling up Washington, no doubt, saying, what do we have to do to assert our authority in this region, right? We don't think of them as having agency. And I can assure you, we do not think of them as having their own agency, right? We think of them as they are subordinate to us, the biggish power in the South Pacific, and therefore we're not going to let them get away with this. And then we do to them what if Russia or China did a 1% of it to us, we would scream and weep and wail and gnash teeth. Oh, it's foreign interference. Yet we think we have the right to do that to these countries, and that's what we're doing over there.
Exactly, and Australia, the age, helping certain groups of people get into office. That is internal political affairs. No country has a right to do that to another country. And I noticed this is very striking. I don't know if you can see this, Robbie, but this is the trade, and you see, where did the Solomon Islands export? So when they're making things and trying to sell it to someone, who is buying most of it? It's China. And look at Australia down here. It's not even 1%. And the United States is even less. And Australia has a more significant role in sending goods to the Solomon Islands, but not buying it. But still, China dominates. So China dominates infrastructure, development, trade, and now security. And why did Australia have this relationship with the Solomon Islands, this security pact? What was the purpose of that? And when you see Australia and the United States meddling in the Solomon Islands' internal political affairs, sending money to basically separatists who sent violent mobs to the main island to burn the capital down, how can you have a security pact with a country that is actively trying to destabilize your country? And then, isn't it, in your mind, at least from my point of view, it seems natural that the Solomon Islands would want a security pact with a country who's actually interested in peace and stability because they're doing so much business there versus Australia?
Yeah, well, in the past, we've sent in peacekeepers more than once into the Solomon Islands. It has a tumultuous history, I mean, by its standards. But I'm now knowing what we're doing in the present, Brian. I've got no confidence that we weren't causing trouble in the past either to help set up this need for Australian peacekeepers to be sent in there, right? But nevertheless, we have a security pact with the Solomon Islands, and so they can call on us, and we can encourage them to call on us to say, okay, you need to send in Australian troops. There is more than one ethnic group in the Solomon Islands, and of course, those there's Melanesians and Polynesians, and those kind of divisions can be played upon, and they do get played upon. But and I'm only saying that because that is a tactic for the divide and conquer set, right? They love to see ethnic divisions and things like that. Nevertheless, we have this, and let's just give Australia the benefit of the doubt that we have it in good faith, and we send in we're available to help the Solomons with internal security concerns if they need us. Well, the Solomons are saying to us with this security deal they're signing with China is they're going to have both. They're not scrapping the security deal with Australia, but they're saying just as we have the right to sign a security deal with you, we have the right to sign a security deal with China, right? And it's the Solomons as a sovereign country saying that. Now, this week, you want to see an act of interference and, frankly, a colonial mentality. The headline in Australia this week was the Solomon Islands government ignored the warnings of intelligence agencies about its security pact with China. Now, what did that actually mean in practice? What it meant was Australia sent 2 senior intelligence officials to the Solomon Islands to talk to the Prime Minister and warn him of how we would react if he signed the pact with China. Those are the consequences, what we would do to him if what Australia's reaction would be. Because there's no actual security consequences for the Solomons beefing up its security, right, frankly. I watched your video of this. It was excellent. The countries that have these business interests want to know that they'll be protected. And the Solomons has a history. And of course, this has flared up following what happened before Christmas there, where Chinese merchants in Guadalcanal were killed in those riots, right? Yes. And so it's natural for the Chinese to express concern. So all the deal is the Solomons said, if we choose to invite you, we will invite Chinese police and military officials if necessary come in for domestic security purposes, right? And that's perfectly legitimate. That was greeted with screaming headlines in Australia. Oh, China's setting up a secret military base in the Solomon Islands, and it was nothing of the kind. And I put out I think you probably saw it, I put out on Twitter the actual wording of the agreement that had been leaked to that point. And more to the point, forget the wording of the agreement, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands is showing real spine here. He is standing up to the Australian government and saying, no, it's not what you're saying it is, but even so, what we're doing is our business, thank you very much. And that's what he said to these 2 intelligence officials, right? And yeah, if you don't have the prejudice against China and you just look at it through the eyes of the Solomon Islanders. This is a perfectly reasonable agreement they've got. But I want to, if you don't mind, I want to go back to 2018 when that Richard Marles said what he said about we're expected to lead in the Pacific, because that was in the context of another scandal that involved a different Pacific Island country, which is Vanuatu. And the headline that greeted us in the middle of the year in 2018 was, China has going to develop a secret Navy base in Vanuatu, which is slightly even, well, it's further south than the Solomon Islands. I wouldn't say it's necessarily closer, but it's probably the same distance, maybe slightly closer than the Solomon Islands. This secret naval base. And Australian defence officials were talking about it. The Australian media was talking about the fact that the journalist who broke the story now is an advisor to our current foreign minister. And so he's in the office that's having this hissy fit over what the Solomon Islands is doing now. So this guy has form. But this whole claim, Richard Barden in our office wrote an article. He debunked it immediately at the time. The whole claim of a secret naval base in Vanuatu was because some US Navy people visited Vanuatu and they noticed that the port, which had been dredged, was really deep and wide. And they said, this is what they said, we could fit some of our aircraft carriers in here. Well, actually, the quote is, wow, this can accommodate a US aircraft carrier. And that quote, that observation became the basis of a Chinese whispers, if I could use that term, thing that reached Canberra that said, if it's that big, the Chinese could use it. And that's all it was. Anyway, the reason I wanted to highlight that is because I want to read a quote from the Vanuatu Post in 2018, where the reporter, Dan McGarry, expressed, I think, a really good point of view that countries like Australia and the United States should take seriously. The headline was, want to lead in the Pacific, which is the formulation of that Richard Marles quote. Try listening first. He pointed out that Vanuatu's debt to GDP ratio is less than half of Australia's, and that in any case, the country's loans don't contain language that would allow China to use debt for equity swaps to take over infrastructure, as Australian analysts predict. Quote, the Chinese base's folderol is just the latest chorus in a litany of Australian indifference to the Pacific voices, McGarry wrote. Quote, every time some tendentious prat opens their mouth and starts telling the Pacific what's good for Australia is obviously good for us, the entire region sighs. Can we get something clear? If you want us to listen to you, you've got to listen to us. The main difference between Beijing and Canberra is that Beijing listens. End quote.
Yeah. Don't you think it's ironic? Don't you think it's ironic that we keep hearing about how Russia's security concerns are completely illegitimate? Ukraine has the right to become a NATO member, even though the US went in there and blatantly overthrew the government in 2014. Yeah. And yet now, say for the Solomon Islands, don't they have the same agency as, I mean, in my opinion, they have more agency than Ukraine because their government wasn't overthrown. And now they're deciding to do this, and we're all being told that they can't decide that. That's not their decision to make. Somehow they are beholden to Australia's security concerns, or even America's security concerns thousands of miles away on the other side of the ocean. It really is unbelievable hypocrisy, and it illustrates kind of the colonial mentality that has, I think, prevailed even to this day. And I just wanted to ask, I mean, in your opinion, do you feel like not just the Solomon Islands, not just Taiwan are being used as battering rams against China, against their own best interests, but isn't Australia also being used in all of this as a battering ram against China, against their own best interests, like the trade that they are losing by this willful belligerence out of nowhere for no reason? And then the last part of the question will be, isn't it Australia's insistence on telling the Solomon Islands what to do and it helping the US interfere there? Isn't that what would just drive them closer to China and create these problems? Like Australians are worried about China invading. They were more than happy to trade. And then when you become belligerent, that's what raises the prospect of military confrontation. What are your thoughts on that, Robbie?
Well, the second one first, of course. But the problem, so you think, yes, they're going to drive the Solomon Islands into China's arms. But of course, they have this intelligence network, dirty tricks operations ready to go, like they're already playing Malaysia against the mainland. By the way, my brother-in-law comes from Malaysia. I'm married to I'm related to a Solomon Island family. They play them off against the mainland, and they know that any normal country would get their back up, but they've obviously got long-term plans to try and overthrow the government if they need to, and that's where the logic of that sits with them. But of course, Australia is being used in this regard, and we're allowing ourselves to be used. You've got to think about the logical sequence here. The United States is not threatened by China, not in any way, shape, or form. China is not China may be construed through longbows to be threats to other places, but there's no way anyone in a million years could actually seriously accept that China is a threat. China is, to the United States, is a rival. Now, China doesn't want to be a rival. China holds the most US debt, right? It's got a vested interest in America having a functional economy because it's got $1 trillion of its dollars. And China wants to do business on a win-win basis. So look at the way China, with the Belt and Road, China announces the Belt and Road and invites the United States to join the equal most powerful country, or if you want to call it the more most powerful country in the world, could be a joint partner in the Belt and Road and be helping in those projects all around the world and settle any question about them being used for coercion or whatever. China's invited the US to do that. But when the US did things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China was excluded from that, right? When China announced the Australian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the US put out the order, do not join it. Now, back then, to illustrate how quickly this turn has been in our country, in 2015, we did join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We wouldn't even dream of that now. We would wet our pants at the prospect. But so America is insisting on seeing China as a rival, and to justify treating it that way, it has to paint it as a threat. But there's no way it's a threat to them. So then the propaganda comes out, and it's got to be a threat to the United States friends, right? And then pro-US politicians in Australia, they get to jump up and down about how much China's a threat, clearly a threat to Taiwan. And then because we believe in democracy, etc., and we would not want a democratic country to be overrun, even though it's not a country, it's a province, and that is our policy as a country. You're right. We accept that there's one China, and Taiwan is a province of China. That's Australia's current policy. We haven't changed that policy, but our politicians don't use that language anymore. They talk about Taiwan as if it's a country and it's a democracy, and therefore we would absolutely have to defend it. And then what that does, of course, is it raises the temperature. And then there's other things that we start doing. We make these claims about foreign interference that aren't real. We had an academic in 2018 write a book called Silent Invasion. Right? Every politician read it. Everyone wets their pants. They're among us. The biggest ethnic group in Australia is ethnic minorities, the Chinese population, nearly 2 million of them. And the book said that 40% or 30 to 40% are loyal to Beijing. And so in the Red Dawn style secret invasion that's going to happen, they will, rise up against us. It was deliberately done. So what happens? Chinese people start getting assaulted on the streets of Australia. And the ambassador said, listen, you're one country. This is what he said in 2020. We send all our students to you, and their lives are going to be, it's a dangerous environment for them now because of this climate you've created. Maybe they'll start going somewhere else, right? Maybe they'll stop buying Australian beef and Australian wine, etc. But did Australia decide to change that? No, COVID came along, and then on America's behalf, not just on America's behalf, on the worst neocons in the White House behalf, when they decided that whereas in January, Trump praised Xi and China's fight against COVID. By the time April came around and they're trying to cover their butts because of how disastrous the American response had been, right? They've got to blame China now. Who did they get to do it? Australia. And we allowed ourselves to be used like that. We started losing all these markets, right? Beef, wine, wood, lobsters, all sorts of things. Christmas 2020, I ate nothing but lobster, Brian, because it was so cheap because we weren't sending it to China anymore. And this was all our farmers are on all these producers are on their knees. These were hard-won markets and they're on their knees. And who ended up with them? The United States. Yeah. Those exports were filled by the United States. And this is us, like Australians need to have some self-respect here. Why are we allowing this to be done to ourselves? Because if you brought up the Atlas map equivalent of Australia's economy, it's just the same. China is our biggest trading partner by a country mile, and it's our best trading partner by a country mile. We have a massive surplus with China. We make $70 billion a year out of trade with China. Our trade with the United States costs us $30 billion a year.
Yeah.
Right? And yet they're the ones that we decided to pick a fight with. So, no, that's what we've done. We've been used as a battering ram. John Lander's argument is it's going to get worse than that. We're talking ourselves into being used as a proxy in a war, a shooting war, in which China would be safe to shoot back at Australians because that wouldn't start World War III, right? But it wouldn't shoot back at Americans, just like is happening in Ukraine. And this has gone so far, we're talking ourselves into that.
Yeah, and one last question. I mean, looking at what happened to Ukraine, how the U.S. Put people into power in Ukraine and just set them on a collision course with Russia deliberately. And they knew that that was what was going to happen. Yeah. And now the catastrophic consequences that everyone in Ukraine is paying because of this handful of people they installed into power. They've kind of done the same thing in Australia. They put these people into power and they're all connected with these think tanks that are funded by arms manufacturers. It's a tropism. You know, they just by their nature seek conflict and confrontation because it is making their sponsors money. But by doing so, they're also feeding Australia into the same wood chipper Ukraine's going through right now. So from your point of view, is there anything Australians can do or people around the world can do to avoid the same fate as Ukraine? If so, what is it? What can people do?
Well, we do need people to take the scales off their eyes and see this for what it is. And so what I encourage people to do is actually take stock at how quickly this has changed. Because until, the Prime Minister, Xi Jinping came to Australia in 2015, I think, and addressed our parliament. And he signed a comprehensive strategic partnership deal with Australia. The Prime Minister who did that, he addressed the parliament. Everyone welcomed him. It was quite a big thing. That was 2015. That Prime Minister, who's now an ex-Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, last year went to Taiwan and gave a speech in Taiwan about how Australia should commit to joining with Taiwan in a war against China. And he's doing that partly to make up for the fact that he now feels embarrassed that he was the Prime Minister who brought the President of China to Australia. But why didn't he feel, because he's actually quite an idiot, that's Tony Abbott. So why didn't he feel embarrassed then? Because everything about our relationship with China was very positive, right? It's just turned so quickly. And so the modern generation of politicians are idiots. Look at these old timers. Look at why a generation of older guys are saying, and it's almost universal across the board. Journalists, diplomats, politicians, even military people are saying, whoa, what has happened here? Australians need to take stock of that. So even though in the space of 2 or 3 years, public opinion has gone from being 40% against China to more than 80%, that is rapid, right? I'm encouraging my fellow Australians, take stock. Why do you think it's happened so fast? We're the only political party in Australia that's actually combating this forcefully, right? And so if you're an Australian watching this, get behind and you share our concern, get behind our party. There is a growing peace movement, but it's got to get people actually. it's got to get more active, because people actually have to see that this could end in war. If you didn't think of it before Ukraine, realize it now.
Yeah.
Right, this is where these things head. As we said on the John Lander interview, Russia told the West for 30 years what its red line was in Ukraine, right? And it took it seriously. And if you think Russia's red line is serious, China's red line on Taiwan is even more serious, right? And so if we keep talking ourselves into this, that's what people got to understand. Back off from doing that. And then the other thing is, there is a better way. Actually, look at what China's offering with the Belt and Road, right? Mutually beneficial infrastructure development. The whole world can turn its back on war and say, let's concentrate on our problems here. We've just had these massive repeat floods on our east coast, and the area doesn't have adequate flood protection infrastructure. Not to go off on a tangent, but the Dutch, who half their country is under the sea level, they spend 97% of their flood-related expenditure on infrastructure to mitigate and prevent floods, and they spend 3% on cleanup and recovery. We do the opposite. We spend 3% on mitigation and 97% on cleanup and recovery, because we don't have the infrastructure. We should make that our biggest priority, right? Chinese people who have so experienced in building infrastructure, they can be coming in and helping us how to do it. But we're a skillful economy. We could be sending people to participate in those Belt and Road projects in other parts of the world. We should be using our status. I'm glad we're America's ally. Like, historically, it was very important in World War II, as you know. That's when we did have a moral high ground in fighting back against the Japanese. But we have been loyal, way too loyal. We've joined America in every war for a century. But we should use that status to say to the United States, come on, this has got to stop, right? Let's try and send the influence back the other way. And that's the sort of thing that we're trying to do as a political party. America needs to concentrate on its own. I mean, I think one of the reasons America demonizes China so much is because if the American people actually paid attention to the differences in the economies, they'd all mutiny, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what we've got to send back. We've got to send the influence back the other way. And our party is trying to do that. And I think if more people around the world look at it that way, we can start to get somewhere.
Where can people find and follow your work, Robbie?
www.citizensparty.org.au, one word. You can follow me on Twitter at Robbie Barwick. And there's you can find the Citizens Party Twitter account through that. We're on Facebook, etc. We have a YouTube channel called the Citizens or the Citizens Party, but we have a weekly show there, and that's where you'll see the John Lander interview on our YouTube channel.
Yes, an incredible interview. You were both point on literally everything you were both saying. Thank you so much for your time, Robbie. I know you're busy, so I'll let you go. Brian. And I hope to have you back on in the near future. Thanks again.
Happy to, mate.